Welcome to the Fairy Tale Magazine's Fairy Tale Voices. I'm Kelly Jarvis, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by Kell Woods, a best-selling historical fantasy author who has spent her life surrounded by stories, working in libraries and museums while spinning novels like After the Forest and Upon a Starlit Tide. Kell, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks for having me. It's lovely to be
Well,
here.
we're so excited. Let's begin by taking a walk together through the forest, right? Your debut novel, After the Forest, tells the tale of Greta and Hans 20 years after they encounter the fairy tale witch in the woods. And your short story, Before the Forest, uses the juniper tree to explore the early life of that witch. Why do you think that forests and the witches who live in them are such evocative elements in fairy tale and fiction?
That's a really interesting question, and I guess one that goes back to when I was a little kid. Um, I was obsessed with forests and the forest fairy tales, ones like Snow White, Hansel and Gretel, um, Snow White, Rose Red. There seems to be something about characters having this dark, scary, quite scary forest where magical things happen and strange things happen. And it's just incredibly appealing. Even like as an adult, obviously it's still really appealing to me. I think it ties in with history. I think fairy tale and history really can't be separated. And I think back in the day when people were telling these verbal fairy tales to each other, the forest was bigger, it was darker, and it was scarier. There were wolves in there who would eat you. Like, look at Little Red Riding Hood, right? There were actually scary things in the forest, and you didn't want your kids to go wandering off in there. So I feel like we almost have this collective interest and almost fear of the dark woods, and I feel like that's why it keeps coming out in stories again and again and again.
Yeah, so we're drawn to them even as we're repelled by them. And it makes for a good fairy tale setting, a good story setting. Well,
Yeah, it
your latest,
does.
yeah,
Sorry, even here in Australia, like even though we don't have the big European forests and the forests that you have in North America, the bush is an incredibly scary place. And there are so many, there's stories of children going missing in the bush and all of this folklore around it. So it doesn't matter where in the world you are, there is an element of the big forest, the dark forest. Sorry, I
you'll
had to add
find a
that.
forest anywhere. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Well, your latest novel moves away from the forest and toward the seashore. Upon a Starlit Tide is inspired by the Little Mermaid and Cinderella, with some shades of Bluebeard thrown in for good measure, right? So lots of fairy tales kind of coming together in that book. Can you talk a little bit about the points of intersection that you see in Cinderella and the Little Mermaid and share why you wanted to use those two stories to tell your own story in Upon a Starlit Tide?
The way that that book came together for me was so interesting because it was all about meetings, like similarities and things that I could pull together. I started off wanting to write The Little Mermaid. It was just going to be a straight sort of Little Mermaid retelling. I started thinking about this 10 years ago. My first journal, my first sort of writing notebook about it was back in 2015. And I was going to set it here in Australia originally. I was going to set it here because I live right near the sea. I live in Jervis Bay, which is a really big, beautiful bay. We have many amazing white sand beaches and an incredibly rugged and beautiful cliff sort of coastline where there were many, many shipwrecks back in the 1800s. So I was going to set it out on this, ruined lighthouse and have it set more like I guess, leaning into that Celtic folklore with Selkies and that kind of thing. And then I realized that it was going to be set in the mid 1800s, which I just was worried about the lack of magic. I feel like the early modern period, in a way, people believed more in magic. As I said before, the forests were bigger and wilder. People were still incredibly superstitious, and that folklore was still alive and breathing. So I wasn't super confident in the 1800s as a period, and I was a little bit also concerned with cultural appropriation with stealing stories of the Aboriginal people, of the Indigenous people that live out on that coastline as well, which is something that as an Australian I'm incredibly aware of. So I ended up moving the story to France, to Brittany. And when I did that, I was like, oh, maybe I can add another fairy tale in here, because The Little Mermaid is so sad and dark and tragic. And I thought, I might be nice to kind of pull another one in there and weave it in. And being, now that I'm using a French setting, I could look at maybe Cinderella, which is so beautiful and sort of sparkly and romantic and a lot lighter in a lot of ways. It's got the older version obviously is pretty disturbing, as so many of the fairy tales are, but I felt like those two could come together. And when I started looking at it, they actually did have some amazing similarities. So both Cinderella and the Little Mermaid have a wealthy or sort of powerful father. They have sisters. The mermaid sisters are a lot kinder, obviously. They're both motherless, and they feel trapped by circumstance, and they receive help from a sort of aged, wise, old woman figure in the fairy godmother and the sea witch. And I know those two women are quite different, but perhaps they could be the same character. And also there's a prince in both of those stories, and that quite sort of romantic sort of element. So I felt like I could maybe pull those together, play with them, and come up with something that was a new tale, but use those motifs and elements, because I love doing that. It's so fun.
I loved the way that all of that came together in your novel. It was absolutely beautiful. The way two stories that you don't necessarily think of as being similar complemented each other to tell a new tale. You mentioned that you live in Australia, and you are actually a featured writer at this year's Australian Fairy Tale Society conference, which is titled Overwater, Underwater, Magical Waters of Fairy Tale. You mentioned you grew up near the sea, you still live near the sea, and you do weave an incredible amount of mermaid lore and seafaring superstition into Upon a Starlit Tide. Does the sea itself inspire your writing in any way? And why do you think water features in so many fairy tales?
Yeah, there's something magical about water, isn't there? Whether it's a river or a lake or the sea. I do live near the sea. I swim. I'm not swimming anymore. The whales are here now. It's a bit cold in Australia, so I have a rule: if the whales are in the bay, it's too cold for me. It's too cold. But but I do swim all through the summer and spend a lot of time on the beaches. And I wrote quite a bit of Upon a Starlit Tide while I was sitting on the beach in a notebook and in and out of the water. And I like to think that sort of soaked into the book. I wanted you to be able to smell the sea air and feel the sand and feel how much Luce loves and is connected to the water. So I wanted that to soak into it, and I hope it did. And I went over to Brittany too, and I walked on the beaches and I watched those incredibly large tides that they have. I think they're the biggest tidal shift in Europe, massive, like 12 to 14 meters of changes between high and low tide, which obviously seemed like the perfect thing to add to the magic system in the book as well. So I spent a lot of time on the beach thinking about the sea, its rhythms, and it was sort of natural to me because I spend a lot of time in the sea as well. I find it incredibly peaceful. If you've had a horrible day, or if you're worried about things, there's nothing better than just diving, head under, feeling that water sort of sweep over your body. It's a beautiful feeling, and I feel like humans have always felt that too. It's one of those old things. Didn't we come from the sea? Isn't that what what the theory is with life? There's that ancient tie, and also it's mysterious and a little bit scary. Like, I'm scared of the sea. It's terrifying too, and I think that's that ties into that mermaid lore. They're beautiful and alluring, and they can be really generous and giving and give wishes to the fishermen and do good deeds. But then they can also just grab you and drown you and drag you to the bottom and eat you. So there's that, that back and forth, and that darkness and that light. I feel like mermaids have it and the sea has it. And there's just something really magical and appealing and ancient about that.
There certainly is. And it almost sounds a lot like the appeal of the dark forest, which is interesting as well, because they're such different environments, but yet there's so much that's similar about them. And your book absolutely does give people a sea vibe. I think I read it in February when it was released here in America. And I'm a beach girl, and I absolutely longed for the sea again and couldn't wait to get there after reading Upon a Starlit Tide. In your books, you work with a lot of well-known fairy tales, right? So Hansel and Gretel, The Little Mermaid, but you also do use a lot of folklore. You use a lot of lesser-known fairy tales like the juniper tree or Snow White and Rose Red. What is your research process for uncovering obscure folklore and lesser-known fairy tales? And did you discover a favorite piece of folklore or fairy tale that you wove into your story or that you hope to weave into your stories in the future?
That's an interesting question because it's hard to remember what I did. You know, like you look back and you're like, how, because it's a very organic process. And the pieces of the stories and the pieces of the folklore kind of come through the research process. So I'm an ex-librarian. I was a reference librarian. So it was my job to do research and help people. And I worked with a nonfiction collection. And I'm such a nerd, Kell. I just love research and books and history and all of that. So I dive quite deep into that. And I really think that's where I find all these weird little the stories and the folklore and the history. So many ideas I have come directly from history. Like I didn't really make that much weird stuff up in After the Forest. People really believed that a witch could make a magical salve and smooth that onto a wolf skin, like a skin or a pelt or a belt, and a person could change into a wolf. Like they 100% believed that. I learned that at uni when I was doing some history study. So it kind of comes organically and naturally as I read, and then there's a lot of that thinking and then connecting the dots in a way. So it's not something I do consciously. I think it just happens over time as part of that process. But yeah, it comes back to the research and the reading and the thinking and having a notebook and taking time to ponder on things and just instinctively going, oh yeah, I like that idea. And there are similarities there. Like with Cinderella and the Little Mermaid, you don't really think about it, but they both have a thing about feet, like the glass slipper and the mermaid's feet, you know, that obsession with not having a tail and legs. So even though they're quite separate ideas, if you pull them together, oh yeah, there's definitely some foot stuff in both of these tales, which I didn't think of at first, but you know, oh, okay, there's something there. I could do something. So it's quite a natural, organic sort of process that comes from the process of reading and jumping around through different topics and going back into history and then looking at the folklore and then just having a look at fairy tales, skimming through the different tales, just waiting for that shiny thing to attract my attention.
Yeah, I actually love that answer. I think it's beautiful to think of the way all these things sort of coalesce together in a writer's mind and then create something that is wholly new. So I think that that is actually pretty fascinating. Your novels have been very successful, so well received, so well loved by readers. Can you offer any breadcrumbs of advice to other writers who would like to work with fairy tale and folklore in their own writing? And can you give readers any clues as to what they might be able to expect coming from you next?
I guess one of the hard things and one of the things to be aware of when you're working with fairy tales and folklore and history is that, you know, times have changed and you always have to have in the back of your mind that you're writing for a contemporary modern audience. And I'm always aware of that with the female characters and the way that I'm writing about women and really everybody, all the characters. But that's something that you have to be quite aware of because fairy tales aren't always politically correct and they're not always fair in the way that they portray people. So you want to freshen that up. And that's the beauty of it. You can get in there and retell things and change things and also have an opinion about things that maybe aren't fair or right, that were wrong back in the past. I remember with Greta, when I first wrote After the Forest, in my early drafts, my agent is an ex-publisher, so she's very hands-on and she'll do structural edits with me, and we did that together with that book. And she said, I want Greta to be more autonomous. I want her to be feistier and stronger. And I said, I can't possibly do that. she's a 17th century woman. Women wouldn't have behaved like that. She would have been run out of town. And my agent said, but Kell, you're writing fantasy. You can go for it. You know, you can do it. You can change things, and you can. And I went, oh my gosh, that's so interesting. And I did. I felt more comfortable then. I had permission to make Greta perhaps behave in a way. It still took her a while. I tried to keep her as, you know, like ground down by that society and religion and the patriarchy as I could. But then I wanted to have that moment of breaking out, because when I look back at the way women were treated, it just makes me so angry. So you can write into that. You can lean into that when you're retelling fairy tales and writing historically. So that's something that I would keep in mind if I was writing something like that. You know, really think about the social context and what was happening at that time politically and religiously, and how women were treated, how people were treated, and then try and frame it so that you don't want to annoy your modern readers. It has to be palatable. It has to be fresh enough. It's weird because you're doing really old stuff for a really contemporary reader. It's a strange balancing act in a way, writing historical stuff.
And that spark within women may very well have been there. It just may not have been recorded by the men who were telling the stories at the time. So you're
Yeah.
almost giving them a voice, or letting their voice be heard through that vehicle of fantasy, which I think is really kind of cool. Any clue though as to what's coming next? Those of us who are waiting for your next novel?
I can. It's all very hush hush still because it's early days. But I am working on something new. I'm sort of falling deeply into something new. And all I can really say about it is that it's going to be a lot colder than my other books.
Oh,
Yeah, maybe a bit
okay.
snowy.
A winter landscape. All right. So we're moving from the forest to the sea into the tundra.
Yeah.
Well, we can't wait to see what you have planned next. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much, Kelly. Always a pleasure to talk about this stuff. I love it.
And you can learn more about Kell Woods on her website, kellwoods.com. And we highly recommend that you let her beautiful language sweep you out to sea or spirit you away into the forest in Upon a Starlit Tide and After the Forest. Once again, this has been Fairy Tale Voices. I'm Kelly Jarvis, and for everyone at the Fairy Tale Magazine, thanks for watching.